Hi, welcome to Jade Kind Gaming. My name is Adam. Today I'm putting together a little video on world building. I guess a first-ish video on world building. I've come up with some ideas, and I've been a game master, dungeon master, for a number of years. Enough that I feel old. And I'm no expert by any means, but I've definitely had some experiences, and world building is definitely one of the things that I love most about being a dungeon master. So I've thought of some ideas, and I'm basically starting a bit of a series. Not sure how long it'll go for, or how often I'll contribute to it. But basically the idea is, let's discuss world building. Today we're going to go into choosing sort of a flavor, a setting flavor. But before that, really, this being the first sort of this world building idea, is the idea of, this is if you want to build your own world. There are worlds already made. You know, you can get a book like Sword Coast Adventures Guide, or the Tal'Dorei campaign setting, and you can run in someone else's world. You can sit down and spend, depending on how fast of a reader you are, a few days or months reading a book. Maybe you already know the world of Tal'Dorei if you've watched Critical Role, and it would just be the natural world for you to run Dungeons and Dragons in, or you've read a lot of the books or whatever, and you just know the Forgotten Realms, and you're comfortable there, and you don't really care to come up with your own world. Don't feel like you have to make your own world. I talk about a lot of things like it's just the assumed way of doing things, because for me it is. Because, like I said, for me that is so much of the fun of what Dungeons and Dragons is, to be a game master, is I get to make my own worlds. Like, I don't even just have one world that I use all the time. I make a new world for most of my games. I maybe revisit a world occasionally. Like, I've started to think, like, maybe I should come up with some world and actually work on it over and over and see what I could do. And I might do that. That'd be cool. But that's not even what I usually do, because I like coming up with all that world building stuff each time. It is so fun for me. So I talk about world building like it's what you do to be a dungeon master, but you do you. Don't worry about it. If that's not what is fun for you, then that's not what you should be doing. It is fun for me, and for those of you who find it fun or interesting and just want to learn about it, that's why I'm going over world building. And like I said, to start off, it's sort of the idea of a setting flavor. And you don't necessarily even have to think about it. You can just go with, whatever, fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons has a general flavor. If you just read through the rules, there's kind of a flavor that it's written for. It's sort of a mid to high level of fantasy and magic for based on like a medieval setting, like a medieval Europe. Very much like what Forgotten Realms is, and from what I've seen in Critical Role, where they're set, it's just sort of this general fantasy world. And you can just run that. It's fine. I do it a lot of the time. It is very fun. But if you want to change it, you should make that decision to start. Because if you don't actively make a decision to change it, that's what you're going to end up with, just based on all that's available in Dungeons and Dragons. Because there are many ways to change it, but you kind of have to choose to do so, or if you just pull all the stuff from the game and just put it all in, that's what you're going to get. And I'd even encourage you, if you are thinking, like, the first time you're doing world building, probably just stick with it, assuming that's what you know. Now, if you're really big, if you're like a Egyptian history buff, and you know all that stuff much better than you know medieval Europe, then do that instead. But in general, from the way fantasy is, you probably know that general. Fantasy is my assumption, and if that's what you know best, just stick with what you know best. Just make it easier for yourself. But as you expand, it can be fun to experiment with some different flavors. A fairly simple change would be to sort of change the level of magic, the level of how fantastic the world really is. You can take it all the way down to no magic, and you end up with a very medieval Earth sort of setting. Or you could go to a very low magic, low fantasy, and get something kind of Knights of the Round Table. Yeah, you have Maryland, but most of that, is, the exciting story bit is, has some magic and fantasy. That's what makes that the story they're telling. But if you look at the world they're set in, the normal person's never seen magic and doesn't really believe it exists. You can definitely go to that low level of magic. Or you can kind of go to a mid to low kind of level and get something similar to Lord of the Rings, where there at that point you get, fantasy races and such, but, the monsters that you're fighting tend to be a lot of the trolls over and over, and that kind of, less variety, less, less common, wizards aren't innumerous. You can't just go train to be a wizard in Lord of the Rings. There are the wizards, and you are one, or you're not. So that's sort of a, hey, there's definitely some magic within the world, definitely some fantastic elements, but it's kind of lower-ish, and you can go on the other extreme, like I said, normally D&D is sort of that mid to high level. You can really go into like a high level of magic in there and have it where your world, like the common folk, all have access to magical solutions to their problems. Basically, just the idea of give every commoner, every character gets 4 cantrips from, a list of their choice. Just do that, and all of a sudden you have a much higher level of magic in your world because everyone has magic. And then you get your people of power in that kind of world are going to have access to the great, powerful magics. And that can definitely, and you end up with everyday magic items and all of that, and that can give like a really high level of magic to your setting. And those each have different feels to them. And another change you could make would be what the Earth comparison would be. Typically, D&D is based on sort of a medieval Europe sort of idea, and really across Europe. But you could change that. You give it more of a Middle Eastern kind of flavor to things, and give it sort of an Arabian Nights feel, like Aladdin and such. You can go Far East, and get more of that. What would traditionally be the Oriental adventures. If you look at, there were actually books in previous editions of D&D. Doubtful if they released that again, that it would keep the same title, but still, a great fun setting would be sort of, I guess if we're going to call that one like Aladdin, like Mulan. Let's do Disney comparisons. You could do the same thing, sort of more narrow down what area of European thing, like a Greco-Roman kind of feel. Hercules. Sorry. But there are other ones. You can choose to have settings that are based on like Inuit or Native American cultures. You can have, some, like I said, ancient Egypt is a great inspiration for a setting. Or you could do sort of like old tribal, like African kind of cultures, and base your setting flavor on that. An array of different options that can give a very different feel than that sort of standard medieval Europe kind of feel. So you can change that up. And speaking of medieval, you can make adjustments to the time period. And that can, again, make a great difference. If you go back just a little bit to like a Bronze Age, you get a little bit of a different feel, but it's very similar. but you could go back and all the way, and you could do like almost like a Stone Age kind of game, and just that low level of technology, Stone Age, but maybe it's fantasy, and you've added in magic. I mean, you can end up with quite an interesting feel. I mean, why invent some of the technology that we ended up with if they have access to magic solutions before they've learned to rub two sticks together to create fire? They have learned to just create fire. So why would you need another way to do it? You have magic. You can go to that kind of time period, or you can go further ahead, just a step ahead from the medieval. You can do sort of an age of piracy, which introduces like the blunderbuss and such. Early level firearms, which actually are some basic rules for in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and that can be an amazingly fun setting. If you want a little bit higher technology than typical, they make it very easy to do that, and especially with things like piracy and such, it makes it really fun. You can get that, and cannons. Again, under siege weapons, there are cannons in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So they make that step really easy to do. But you can go further. You can go to sort of a Victorian era, which is visually beautiful. And at that point, people are doing science. So that definitely gives you variety, a bit of a different feel to your setting. Further still, I mean, you can take this all the way forward to a modern age or science fiction. I've actually ran 5th edition on modern Earth. And at that point you require a bit more either homebrewing or finding things online, to be able to, because obviously at that point you're coming up with some different options for classes and that kind of thing. But I mean, that's all available for sure. You could change some things as needed and do any sort of thing like that. And there are other ways that you can add variety to the kind of setting that you're making, as opposed to just standard. You can make it sort of a steampunk setting. That's classic, traditional. There's horror. You can give it a horror feel, whether that's gothic horror focus, and you focus on the werewolves and vampires and ghosts and those kind of things, or whether that's eldritch horror and you focus on aberrations and such. Either of those, you can have a focus with that being part of the flavor of your setting, and have a vast change to whatever it was. The immediate thing that just came to my mind is I mentioned Egyptian sort of Earth comparison. Giving that an eldritch horror twist could be cool. I just thought of that. And then there's other things like even just having a war-torn world. If the world is in upheaval because you are in a city that is part of a nation that is in the middle of war, and and how much that is changing the everyday lives of so many people, loved ones gone at war, you might end up getting drafted or caught up in going out to war. Just the change that having the world in the midst of a war can have on the setting, and because of how long that can last, that can really, that's not something that, you can just begin the game middle of war, and by the time the game ends, unless solving the war is your campaign, it could still just be in the middle of war. That doesn't have to be the plot line. That can just be part of the setting, is that this nation is in war with that nation, and that's where you're taking places between them. And of course, you don't have to choose just one of these flavors. You can mix them. I mean, my typical mental picture with steampunk would, of course, be to apply it to Victorian or fantasy kind of like Victorian or medieval kind of time period. But why not, mix it with modern, and give yourself, modern technology that was crafted with steampunk, and you got your little cell phone, but you have to put little bits of coal in it to keep it burning to be able to use it. Why not mix steampunk with Arabian Nights? Give that sort of feel to that. Or like I'd already said, Eldritch Horror with Egyptian. You can mix some of these things up, and obviously different ones, like you're going to choose how much magic is there. What's the closest Earth comparison? And you can choose more than one Earth comparison and be like, this is a mixture of, whatever, Greco-Roman and Egyptian, and have sort of different, take different aspects of different, because, you're not, unless you're setting it in Earth, then you don't have to just choose one. You can actually mix those up even. Feel free to just sort of play around with it. And finally, if you're looking for more basic information, you have the Dungeon Master's Guide, which, if you're running a game, I would highly recommend. It's not a requirement to be capable of running the game. The inclusion of magic items in it make it very helpful. But it's possible that maybe you've used the magic items and not looked too much else into it. Especially if you're newer at running a game, just pour through the book. There's so many suggestions and ideas. But in the Dungeon Master's Guide on page 38 begins Flavors of Fantasy, and they have different names, and they sort of mix certain bits on their own and give different blocks. Heroic fantasy, sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, mythic fantasy, dark fantasy, swashbuckling, war, mystery, intrigue. So they give them their own pre-mixed versions of this, and of course that's some great examples. And if you're looking to do something other than just sort of standard whatever pours out of the book's fantasy, you can use something like that to focus. If you don't want to try and make your own decision for each part of it. But again, there's much more than those, but those are some good starting points if you're needing help. But yeah, I guess that's the part one with world building, is to decide if you're going to give a specific flavor to the setting. You want to decide it first, because if you decide on doing sort of a Eldritch Horror, you're probably not going to choose to just have a standard red dragon. Now, that's not to say you're not going to pick that monster manual, pull out that red dragon snap block, and write yourself a paragraph of new description, and use that same stat block to do this weird fire-breathing, flying monstrosity of Eldritch Horror. You can still pull those stat blocks, but you're not going to use it as written, probably, because it's not necessarily going to fit that normal flavor for just a standard Eldritch Horror kind of setting. You're going to want to change that. Or choose something else. You may choose the Beholder or the Aboleth instead, because it already fits the flavor. And so that's sort of part of the reason why you'd start by choosing this, is because it's going to influence other decisions you make as you build your world. Thanks for watching. Join me next time for more. Bye.